It's May 13th, 1981, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Today in history in 1981, St. Peter's Square was unusually full, even by Vatican standards. It was the Wednesday general audience, and Pope John Paul II was doing his usual thing of travelling through the crowd in an open white Fiat Popemobile, stopping frequently to bless children and shake hands when suddenly shots rang out.
Yes, and the gunman was a young Turk called Mehmet Ali Ağca. He was planted in the crowd and he had an accomplice with him, and the plan was supposed to be that when he fired at the Pope with a Browning pistol, that the accomplice would set off a small explosion, and in the confusion the two men would be able to get away. But instead, Ağca was immediately seized by bystanders, including the chief of the Pope's personal protection officers, Camillo Cibin, and also a nun. Apparently all these people just grabbed hold of him, held him in place. The accomplice was never able to detonate the explosive and he ran away instead. And meanwhile, of course, people were flocking to the Pope, who had been shot in the abdomen and in his left hand, and the bullet in his abdomen had perforated his small intestine and colon. He ended up losing 3/4 of the blood in his body and undergoing 5 hours emergency surgery, which included basically rerouting his intestines.
Yeah, this was a really serious attack. 4 bullets fired from a 9mm pistol, 15 feet away roughly. 2 struck him in the stomach, 1 in his right arm. 4th hit his little finger. And as you said, this was during the general audience, so in front of obviously kind of 20,000 or so people in the square, but also, of course, video cameras. And that was what was different about this attack on this Pope, is it was quickly beamed across the world and on all the nightly news. We're in 1981. And just a bit of context here, even though any attack on a Pope would have been, obviously headline worthy, in this Pope in particular, I think there was a recognition that we'd seen a shift here. He was the first non-Italian Pope in 455 years, because, until then, God just preferred Italians, but he changed his mind. And he had used this unusual background in the modern era as a Pope, because he was Polish, to become the jet-setting Pope, the well-travelled Pope. And he'd already been visiting the faithful all over the world for 3 years, building this reputation. The Catholic Church is changing. We have a Pope that is different. And so this was a shock, not just to Catholics, but to everybody.
And not least because the gunman was such a curious character right from the start and then all through his life. So Mehmet Ali Ağca was this 23-year-old Turkish national at the time of the shooting. He had a history of political violence and criminal activity. He'd been like a petty criminal and then a member of street gangs in his hometown. And he became a smuggler between Turkey and Bulgaria. He claims to have received 2 months of training in weaponry and terrorist attacks in Syria as a member of the Marxist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which he said was paid for by the communist Bulgarian government, though pretty much everyone denies this. But before the Vatican attack, he'd been convicted in Turkey of the assassination of another guy, Abdi İpekçi, who was a prominent liberal newspaper editor. And this killing was widely attributed to a right-wing extremist network. But he then went to prison for that, but escaped from prison and fled across the Middle East, having already announced that he intended to kill the Pope.
Yeah, when he broke out, it was November 1979, and it was during the insurgent occupation of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. This was a huge deal at the time. About 600 extremist Islamists who believed that the Saudi monarchy was a little bit too chummy with the West sort of invaded this really holy site in the most holy city, obviously, in Islam. And it lasted for 2 weeks. Eventually, Saudi special forces were able to recapture it, but hundreds of fighters were killed on each side. 26 hostages were killed as well. And the incident, this image of Muslims killing other Muslims inside a mosque in Mecca was so shocking to, the Muslim community. And some of them simply couldn't accept that this could happen. And there was this popular conspiracy theory that the attack had been arranged by the West. And that theory was publicly promoted by Ayatollah Khomeini, the new supreme leader of Iran. And Ağca was apparently one who subscribed to this theory because he had left a note in his jail cell before his escape saying that Western imperialists who are afraid of Turkey's unity of political, military and economic power with the brotherly Islamic countries are sending Crusader Commander John Paul under the mask of a religious leader because the Pope was due to arrive in Turkey. And he said, if this ill-timed and meaningless visit is not called off, I will definitely shoot the Pope. This is the only reason I escaped from prison. So his intentions were not hidden.
No, they weren't, but they are confused, as Arian was suggesting earlier, because yes, that's what that note said when he escaped from prison. But there was a handwritten note in his pocket on this day in which he said, quote, I am killing the Pope, fail, as a protest against the imperialism of the Soviet Union and the United States and against the genocide that is being carried out in Salvador and Afghanistan. Obviously, this is 2 years later, so, I mean, okay, the context has shifted somewhat. But nonetheless, you know, he's pointing the finger all over the place, isn't he? Bulgaria, the Russians, the Palestinians, and Italian juries have acquitted other people of their roles in the shooting. But what happened, I think, is that because he's obviously a bit nuts, this guy, that was a convenient get out from the actual reality and motivation of, like, someone did put him up to this. I don't think he was a completely lone wolf. It was reported in the West as a Soviet operation to eliminate a Polish pope who had ideas that would stop the expansion of Russian influence. It was reported in the East as a conspiracy to implicate them because they wanted more influence and the Polish Pope was going to stop them. I think it sort of benefited both sides in the end for them both just to be like, oh, he's a bit weird. This guy's a bit weird. Don't know who did it.
But I think even trying to ascribe a single motivation to someone who's willing to do something like this is a bit of a perversity in its own right. You know, someone who's going to get a gun and try to shoot the Pope could have a lot of things going on in his brain simultaneously. So, you know, the fact that his own explanation for what he was up to shifted so many times during his subsequent incarceration sort of isn't surprising, because he was probably back justifying not only to the world but also to himself what he had done.
Yeah, let's not forget, by the way, that he also claimed to be the Messiah at one point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm fairly sure that wasn't the motivation.
Right.
That he is the Christ eternal. But that was one of the things he did put forward.
But what is definitely true as well is that there was this alliance going on between Pope John Paul II and then President Ronald Reagan to combat communism and, as they had it, tyranny and oppression that was being caused by communism. There was this term that was coined by Time magazine for the coupling of Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, which was this holy alliance, they called it. There definitely was a concerted effort between those two men who, incidentally, had assassination attempts on both their lives within about 7 weeks of one another. Ronald Reagan had almost been shot 7 weeks earlier. So, you know, there was this thing going on, and you could see how certain people around the world, particularly if they had communist or socialist aspirations themselves, may have thought, well, you know, here's two people who we can snuff out and get our ideology up and running properly.
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly a convincing case that the USSR may have been involved. You know, Ağca would tell interrogators that the whole thing was arranged by a military attaché at the embassy of Soviet Bulgaria. I mean, there's also evidence connecting it to Ağca's own group, the sort of ultra-nationalist Islamist group, Grey Wolves, like a Turkish organization. But the USSR was really anti-John Paul II, specifically, you know, obviously all popes have been opposed to communism, but he obviously, as the Polish pope, he was a vocal supporter of the pro-democracy movement in Poland that was sort of breaking through at the time. So there is a plausible case. And the Italian interrogators who interviewed Ağca did think that he had been coached. That was their number one takeaway. They said he was very cool, very calm. He didn't come across as being a crackpot or a religious fanatic. He had lots of different stories, but they definitely came away with the impression that someone somewhere had put him up to this and had prepared him for this exact scenario, because he knew exactly how to deal with the interrogation as well. And I think there is a case to be made that all of these conflicting stories were part of a deliberate attempt to obfuscate the real culprits.
One thing that isn't at question is how the Pope dealt with this, which was appropriately popely. I mean, I'm sure behind closed doors he was annoyed that someone had tried to kill him. But given the trauma that this was for people who witnessed this and for Catholics around the world, and spookily, by the way, today in history, May the 13th, that's the same date as the Fatima apparitions, which you might recall from our episode What Mary Told Me, which was about these kids that supposedly were visited by the Virgin Mary in a cave in 1917. That had also happened on May the 13th. So Catholics were like, this is Mary involved in this, and Mary has saved the Pope. And it was really incumbent on him to meet that moment. And to be fair, he really did. Like, from his hospital bed, the Pope assured Ağca his forgiveness. He called him the brother who struck me. Then, just 2 years later, after he recovered, he went to visit him in prison. He said afterwards, "We met as fellow human beings and as brothers, since we are all brothers, and all the events of our lives must confirm the fraternity that comes from the fact that God is our Father." And then, extraordinarily, in June 2000, I mean, okay, 20 years later, but still, he pardoned him. Like, he encouraged the Italian president to pardon Ağca so that he could leave prison. Although then he did return to Turkey and was immediately rearrested and forced to fulfill the rest of the sentence for killing that journalist that he escaped from. But nonetheless, like, good poping, I'd say.
Yeah, but then he also really did take in the whole third secret of the Fatima prophecy business. The Pope was convinced that Mary had interceded to save him. He said of the shooting, one hand fired the shot, another guided the bullet. And so in 1982, on the first anniversary of the shooting, and he followed through on what supposedly Our Lady of Fatima had requested, this solemn act of entrustment, it's called, and he entrusted the whole world, including Russia, to Mary. This was in 1984 in St. Peter's Square. So he was split between this very human response and this very divine response as well.
And I mean, as for Ağca, people always say, oh, he converted to Christianity while he's in prison, which kind of, but when you actually read, this is when he was fully into his Messiah era. When he was eventually released from prison in Turkey, he said, all the world will be destroyed, every human being will die. I am not God, I am not the Son of God, I am Christ eternal. So, yeah. And then after his release, he wrote a memoir. He continued to change his account multiple times, which is impressive because he'd already given so many accounts. So now, in addition to the Soviets and the Grey Wolves, he now threw in a rogue cardinal as a potential mastermind, and even Ayatollah Khomeini as being the brains behind the assassination. So if you like conspiracy theories, take your pick.
It's rich, fertile ground, isn't it? And then in 2014, he made a surprise visit in front of the Italian press to the Pope's tomb in St. Peter's Basilica and laid white flowers there. I guess he just wanted to check he was definitely dead by then.
Yeah.
It's like, mission accomplished.
Yeah, it's taken me 30 years.
Tomorrow.
It's all very well with hindsight to say this wouldn't have worked in court. But I mean, mind crimes.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.